The MCU ended its 2023 with the release of What If Season 2, which aired its 9 episodes daily between December 22nd and December 31st, a release schedule that I thought worked really well with the anthology nature of the series, and they should do that for every season going forward. With the anthology nature of the series, and with the next season not likely to release for a good while, this would be a good time to look at the 18 individual episodes of the series and rank them from worst to best. This list is entirely based on my personal opinion. Leave your own in the comments down below, make sure to subscribe, and let's begin starting with the worst episode of the series. Looking back now, this Thor episode of What If kind of feels like a warning for Thor Love and Thunder. It's super wacky and very silly. It's a not great take on Thor that sacrifices almost everything for the sake of comedy. There's some great animation and fight scenes, but the story is so simple and uninteresting that it really feels like they wasted the potential of what could have been maybe an interesting what if scenario. It's also not very funny at all. Maybe the most forgettable episode of What If, this Iron Man and Black Panther combo should have been way more interesting than it was. What we are left with is an incomplete episode that doesn't really have the necessary amount of time to complete its story, or at the very least end on a satisfying note. Killmonger is a really cool character, but he's never really given the depth or writing quality he received in Black Panther. This definitely could have been a lot better than it was. While definitely entertaining, especially Justin Hammer, this episode is also incredibly silly and at times even stupid, up until Happy was infected by Hulk blood, which by the way happened completely by accident. It felt like something that could have happened in the main MCU, like I'm not really sure where the timeline deviated. My best guess is that this universe's Justin Hammer got out of jail a bit earlier, and that isn't even confirmed. It's a fun Christmas special, but nothing special in its own right. The first episode of the series showed us some of the main issues of the show that persisted for a lot of it. An art style that is almost great, but not quite. What if premises that the episode doesn't really quite do enough with, as this episode's story is very similar to the first Avenger, but in half an hour as opposed to 2 hours, so the pacing is very quick. Thankfully, this episode got a sequel that is much better. This is one of the most disappointing episodes of the series. It has a really cool premise initially, but the comic had a way more interesting one where the characters retain their personalities as zombies. This episode is also way too fast-paced, way too comedy-focused with a tone that doesn't fit the story at all, and takes away from the stakes, while the story is also incomplete. There are certainly some memorable moments and good animation, and having Spider-Man as the main character, and I think the only Spider-Man appearance in the entire series, is a plus, but this could have been way better. Let's hope Marvel Zombies will be better, and let's hope that show has a more fitting tone, because honestly, it is definitely the tone of this episode, the jokey tone, that is its biggest issue. This is probably the most disappointing episode of the series. Doctor Strange Supreme is completely reverted back to how he was prior to the end of his episode, so he then goes through the same development, having to learn the same lesson, or it's as if he never did. The episode never justifies the Captain Carter focus, a character who at this point has appeared way too many times in this season, and while Kohari's appearance does make sense, it was really jarring having her appear and talk in English, especially with an American accent. Beyond all that, the episode leans heavily on cameos, fight scenes, and spectacle, while almost completely ignoring the plot and character interactions. The fight scenes are mostly good, but honestly nothing special. The animation and visuals are also mostly good, but again, nothing special either. And the plot is paper thin, never doing anything all that compelling, barely making sense, while consisting of zero interesting character interactions either. I like the ending, and the episode is never genuinely bad, but after a relatively consistently good season, this episode was a very disappointing finale that really did not stick the landing. This episode has a really interesting concept, some really good looking visuals and fight scenes, and I really like the parallel with the first Thor movie, how Hela is now going on a similar journey. It also really showcases how terrible of a father Odin is. His children are always bad people who become better when he's just not around. However, this episode does suffer from a bit too much humor, making it a bit harder to take the story seriously, and while the parallels with Thor are apparent and appreciated, it doesn't go unnoticed that Thor, who was never nearly as bad of a person as Hela, went through the same story, or at the very least the same arc, in a 2-hour movie that Hela now did in a 30-minute episode, so the pacing is a bit quick, and the turnaround is a bit less believable. The 10 rings are really cool and used very well. The episode actually briefly expands on Hela's backstory, which adds some layers to that character that could probably be considered canon, and the fight scene at the end is a real highlight. This episode is good, but I do think it could have been great. If episode 1 was the first introduction to this show's really fast pacing, episode 2 was a good introduction to the overly quippy style of dialogue that feels like a bit much even for the MCU. In an extension to that, nothing is really taken quite as seriously as it should. Like if the Guardians of the Galaxy movies were all style and a lot less substance, this episode definitely has style. The animation is really good and the scenery and visuals are captivating. This episode definitely has some substance. It comes mostly in the halfway point with the back-to-back moments of the reveal that Yondu lied about Wakanda and the Nebula triple cross heist plan reveal. There are things that show that they had some really great ideas for this episode, but I don't think they really followed through with them. Like Yondu lying about Wakanda should have led to T'Challa genuinely never forgiving him, so this perfect seeming world becomes a bit imperfect. Instead, it's just a happy world and a happy ending, and that's not very interesting. The story of this episode is a bit too large for the 30-minute runtime, so the pacing is a bit quick, and the way that Ronin, the main villain kind of the episode, is defeated is like, what? You could have done that the entire time. However, this episode does look amazing, capturing the Blade Runner-like visuals so well. There's also a mostly pretty consistent tone with less comedy than usual, although certainly not none, and when there is, it's pretty noticeable. And if nothing else, I thought Nebula was a really cool character with a really great merging of the Nova Corps and Yondu designs with Nebula. Not a fantastic episode by any stretch, but in my opinion, a better start than season 1. Given that it was the Gamora of this world who was recruited by the Watcher, I was surprised at how forgettable Gamora was in this episode and how memorable Iron Man was, who absolutely took center stage. It made me realize that, yeah, I kind of miss Iron Man. Mick Winger did a great job in the role, usually sounding like Robert Downey Jr. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed Iron Man being on Sakaar. It kind of fit him better than Thor. I mean, Transformer Iron Man, that suit was so cool. A rare what-if moment that genuinely impressed me with how it used a character. The animation of this episode is fantastic, the story is paced better than most, and while there was certainly a bit too much comedy per usual, and I am so sick of Korg, some of it was a little funnier than the typical what-if episode. I was very underwhelmed by Gamora's arc, and I guess outside of Iron Man, none of the other characters are all too memorable. However, I do think that this episode really respects Iron Man. If it did come out in season 1 like it was initially intended to, then the narrative that What If hates Iron Man like it hates Thanos, which it still definitely does, wouldn't have existed in season 1 because this episode really understands and really respects the character. As opposed to the immediate setup to this episode, the finale to the first season of What If never really goes beyond being pretty good. The Guardians of the Multiverse are a really fun team with a good dynamic, but even having seen this episode, I'm not sure why in an infinite multiverse these specific heroes were chosen, and I understand even less how they were able to face off against the universe-destroying threat that is the Infinite Ultron. Also, I just don't like this Thor, he's insufferable. Still, this episode looks great, is well animated, has some really great action, and obviously exceedingly high stakes, and is just a really fun episode to watch. While it did feel like Ultron was nerfed for this fight, the way he was defeated through the Arnim Zola virus and subsequent Killmonger betrayal was a really creative ending to this episode. Additionally, Black Widow's ending, being put into the murder mystery world, was something that I thought was handled very well. In a really big improvement on the first Captain Carter episode, the Winter Soldier counterpart gives us a really fun dynamic between Black Widow and Captain Carter, a compelling love story twist on the Winter Soldier story, some really good animation and action, and some really interesting and unexpected twists and turns to this universe, including seeing an old Bucky, Hulk not existing, and Wasp as an original Avenger, as well as the Red Room taking center stage and at least initially being a bit more menacing than they were in Black Widow, as well as ending on the first serialized moment of the season. This episode definitely takes itself a bit more seriously than most, and the story isn't too big to fit into the 30-minute episode, so the pacing works as well. So this episode kind of avoids the most most common what if pitfalls. I guess the main thing holding this episode back is that while the Red Room itself is more menacing, the Black Widows become a bit underwhelming as they are far too easily defeated by Natasha, who definitely should have just died in this action scene. Still, a surprisingly great episode that far surpasses the original. What if the Avengers, assembled in 1602, which is not really what the episode is about, is a really good episode showcasing a very different world that initially seems to not have been created by a what if scenario, but rather like a classic Elseworlds-like tale of placing the Marvel Universe into a different time period, and what they did with that time period was really interesting. I initially didn't really love the idea of Peggy Carter taking focus, as that does deviate from what if is typically about, but as the episode went on, I felt Peggy's role in this episode was really fun and gave us some really great dynamics, especially with Steve Rogers, who's given his best appearance in this series so far, and is the center of the big twist of the episode. As it turns out, this is indeed a what if scenario, which is what if Captain America hit the time stone while fighting Thanos in Infinity War. Not only was this a really great twist that I didn't see coming, it also more than justifies Peggy's role in the episode, at least thematically, as she's forced to kill, or I guess depart from the man she loves. This twist definitely saved the episode for me. It pushed it over the edge from being good to great, as up until this point, while I did find the episode to be fun, exciting, interesting, and well animated, I also found it to be very underwritten, and of course, because this is the main issue with What If, it was too comedic and didn't take itself seriously enough. Weird OLED, however, pushed the episode over that edge. Probably the show's best example of the series taking a moment from a movie, having a character make a different decision, and seeing how different the universe would become because of it. This episode does a great job at that, believably creating an 80s version of the Avengers, while giving surprisingly compelling roles to two characters. One is Bucky Barnes, who I didn't even know was going to be in this episode. That was a genuine shock, and the way that they handled him was really well handled. And then there's Hank Pym, the main character of this episode. This is the second time that What If made Hank Pym better in What If than he ever was in the MCU, and this episode kind of made me wish that Hank Pym was the Ant-Man of the main Marvel Universe in the present day. There's some exciting action and great character interactions, while certain other characters aren't really given the most expansive roles, and the pacing is definitely a bit quick, but this is probably the single most interesting alternate Marvel history to me, and I'd love to see a sequel to it, maybe with Peter Quill becoming the Ant-Man of this world. The first completely original character in a completely original story, this episode does a surprisingly fantastic job at world building for both the Native American culture and the Sky World, helped by the realism of the episode being entirely in Mohawk, which worked better than expected. Apparently there is an English version, but I did not watch that version. Maybe the best looking episode of the show. This episode is brimming with beautiful scenery, really interesting and unique looking Tesseract powers, and great animation, all of which contribute to the world building and to the general enjoyment of the episode. Genuinely, it at times felt like something out of Avatar, which makes sense because Avatar is very visually inspired by Native American culture. The action isn't very impressive, but what is are the characters, who have some really fun interactions and dynamics, the pacing, which fits the 30-minute runtime really well, and the tone, which is consistent and thankfully lacks that What If signature not taking itself seriously enough. This is an incredibly impressive episode that made me interested in an original MCU hero in a world that is very removed from the regular Marvel universe, putting Fury's big week on screen together for the first time. This episode of What If masterfully uses this impactful point in time to unravel the universe with a well-paced, well-written murder mystery that genuinely got me engrossed in its story and in its mystery. Then the reveal is extremely well handled and unexpected, as Hank Pym is used so effectively as an absolutely fantastic one-off villain, showing how terrifying and how powerful Ant-Man can be. Like, this one episode is the best use of Ant-Man's abilities in the MCU outside of the first Ant-Man movie. Also, it's just really cool seeing Mark Ruffalo's Bruce Banner during the events of the Incredible Hulk, which I would have assumed they would stray away from. While episodes 1 and 2 did not live up to their potential, episode 3 is what convinced me that this show is, at the very least at times, definitely worth watching. I think I like this episode more than most. Ultron is the type of villain who who absolutely had Thanos-level main villain of a saga potential, and while that wasn't used in the main MCU, it kind of was in What If. What unfolds throughout the episode is an alternate history where Ultron was allowed to ascend to his final form, or his vision, and become a truly terrifying threat. First to Earth, then to the universe, and finally the multiverse. This episode does a great job at building up to that threat. It takes it seriously, Ultron is very well written, and Ross Marquand does a fantastic job at both mimicking James Spader's voice and just giving a generally great performance. He is pretty threatening. Beyond building up the season's final villain, this episode shows the Watcher in a new, nervous light, puts him into an epic battle that transcends universes, while at the same time also putting its focus on Earth's last hope, Hawkeye and Black Widow, whose close relationship and especially the reverse endgame style sacrifice serves the episode really well for those personal stakes. Care was clearly put into this episode's visuals, animation, action, pacing, writing, and voice acting. The only misstep is Thanos' early arrival, with all the remaining Infinity Stones not aligning with what is supposed to happen. Otherwise, just a fantastic episode that sets up the finale and the final villain of the episode really well. Now, this is everything an episode of What It should be. It is not like a moment from a movie where a character makes a different decision. It's instead a moment in a movie where there are just more factors involved, telling the story of Stephen Strange, a man steeped in depression over the death of the love of his life, and slowly slipping into madness in a failed attempt to save her in a series of events that are high enough stakes for the Watcher to consider intervening. This episode is kind of beautiful in both its emotional core and in its visuals. Between the classic Doctor Strange magic, the universe being destroyed, the mix of 2D and 3D animation, the visuals look better in this episode than almost every other episode of the series. The animation is fantastic, the action is great, the voice acting is really good, the writing is very high quality, and the music especially, it really elevates this episode. The music is beautiful and epic, adding many layers, especially to the montages. Everything is taken as seriously as it needs to be. Jokes are limited, so nothing is ruined by it. The pacing is absolutely perfect, even with the hundreds of years this episode covers. This is a perfect episode of What If, and just a really damn good episode of TV in general. Looking at this list, it's pretty clear that, at least in my opinion, the two seasons are kind of equal in quality. Season 1 is all the way at the bottom, but also all the way at the top, and while season 2 is certainly a lot more consistent, it never reaches the highs of season 1 and has an incredibly disappointing finale. So yeah, I'd say the two seasons are pretty much equal in quality, and that quality is like a 7.5 out of 10. Not quite as good as what I would want it to be, but definitely a fun time.